in midstream, but if everybody's ready, we'll get started. Let me share my screen here real quick.
Couldn't look at the picture.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dan McKay. I've got the pleasure of being the moderator here for this afternoon's webinar, and appreciate you joining and taking an hour out of your day to join us. This is the second session of an HR Huddle series provided by the Hampton Roads Innovation Collaborative in support with Concursive and Hampton Roads Society for Human Resource Management. And we've really been taking a look at the practical realities of managing through the pandemic and tapping into local leaders within Hampton Roads to get a feel for what they've been going through. And today's focus is really on the return to the workplace and how the pandemic has shaped philosophy, decisions, practices around that. We've got great hosts and sponsors and panelists here today. Let me start by introducing Dan Bell. He's the president and CEO of the Hampton Roads Innovation Collaborative. And Dan, I'll give you a few minutes, pass the mic over to you.
Well, it's really measured in a matter of seconds, but good afternoon, everybody. I am Dan Bell with the Hampton Roads Innovation Collaborative, which is your region's tech council. We are a nonprofit 501c6 that's been in existence since about 1997. And our mission is simply to help small business. Technology companies are also a focus, but generally speaking, trying to help business grow, prosper, and help bolster the economic conditions in our region. So it's motherhood and apple pie. And I have a friend and colleague in Dave Richards, who's president and CEO of Concursive, a software development firm up in beautiful Charlottesville, Virginia. And we have known each other for several years. And a few weeks ago, or a few months ago, started talking about collaborating for a series like this. It actually was Dave's idea. And so we started talking about possibilities. Lo and behold, I meet Dan McKay through LinkedIn, and he had the right stuff. We pulled him in, and he's just been a phenomenal collaborator and designer of these programs. So I tip my hat to Dan. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to him.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Appreciate that. Also have the pleasure of introducing our panelists. So let me start with Nick Casasa, who is the controller of ADS Incorporated in Virginia Beach. And as many of you may know, ADS is a leading defense logistics agency. And so they have a strong sales component, sales force to their organization. So we've asked Nick to kind of bring that to the table during the discussion and kind of really represent the impact of the pandemic and how that shapes the workplace from a sales and marketing aspect. And then Dina Kaur is the Vice President of Human Resources at Bauer Compressors. And she's been really leading the response at Bauer as it relates to the pandemic. She's also the president-elect, or now president with the Hampton Roads SHRM. So she's been a great supporter of these sessions as well. Jeff Jaycox is the president of Tabit Manufacturing, and really wanted to get the kind of the voice of the manufacturing and operations on this session. In the prior session, it was all HR representatives on the panel. And so Jeff will give us some good perspective there. And then finally, Brad Salter, who's the Chief Financial Officer with TST Construction. And what's really interesting about this panel is several things. One, they're representing different functions within an organization. So you've got HR and manufacturing and finance and sales, and so they are going to have different opinions about the future of the workplace, and so that's important. They've also really been leading the response for each of their organizations here locally in Hampton Roads. So really expect it to be a rich discussion as we go along. And the case study was really built out of their experiences and what they've been going through over the last several months, particularly as it relates to this topic of remote / flexible work arrangements. So look forward to digging into that case study with them. Now, before we do dive into that, I want to go over really just some research that's out there on the post-pandemic workplace. I don't intend to spend a lot of time here because we really want to dig into the case study. So just know that anything I'm referencing is going to be as part of the PowerPoint, which you'll receive after the call. But just want to pull out a few things. One, Mercer's been doing a series of live surveys on this topic. And because it's live, the information is consistently being updated, and so you're kind of getting it in real time. But one of the questions that they asked, among others, is how would you characterize your status towards a flexible work strategy? And what really stood out is either people are rethinking or creating a strategy as it relates to the pandemic. Now, some had something that existed a little bit beforehand, but by and large, the majority, in many cases, were forced to start to consider something like a flexible work arrangement for their organization. Again, I pulled in information from a number of different companies, different surveys, different research organizations. And, one thing's for certain is that there's no surprise here. Companies are looking at remote work and what does that mean for their organization going forward. And many of them are making it indefinite or permanent going forward. We're familiar with a lot of those names. Some of them are technology companies, but not all technology companies are weighing in on that. So we're seeing an embrace of remote work from other areas. Something I didn't cite in the PowerPoint, but just came up this week in Inc. magazine. They summarized Bill Gates' recent podcast, and he was talking about this topic as well in the future of work. And he highlighted two things. He thinks it's going to be here to stay because, one, the technology around virtual meetings is continuing to evolve. We kind of had a clunky start in the beginning, but now you're starting to see some real advancements in those areas. And then you're also starting to see companies rethink the office space. In many cases, might start cohabitating with other companies to help share in some of that expense and not necessarily have that fixed cost going forward. So obviously a lot of conversation going on about this. From an employee perspective, there was an interesting survey and the numbers just really stood out, particularly this one. 98% of employees that are working remotely now would like to do so for the duration of their career, which is a pretty staggering number when you think about it. And we're going to unpack that a little bit when we get into the case study. But there's a clear interest on the part of employees, and executives in similar surveys have acknowledged the need to do this or the interest in doing that. But it's also balanced by the fact that 60% of the workforce in the U.S., because of the nature of their jobs, can't necessarily work remotely. So it may create some tension between the functions that may have more freedom, more flexibility, and those that don't. So as a result, you've got some real mixed opinions as it relates to work-life balance. And that's really kind of highlighted in some research that came out of APQC, which is a benchmarking organization, and they're continuing to look at IT and finance and HR and knowledge management. And so they've been digging into the future of work as well. And two things I'll highlight here. One, work-life balance is on both the pros and the cons, which is somewhat interesting. On one hand, we're getting more flexibility with managing our day and planning our day and giving us some freedom if we're a caretaker at home for kids that are not going to school or what have you. But at the other time, we're feeling that people are working longer than they may have previously, and so that may be impacting levels of burnout. The other thing that I thought was an interesting note here is that a pro is the diverse perspectives that are coming out, and obviously getting the diverse perspectives, styles, opinions, ideas is really important. But at the same time, it's saying that there's less collaboration, or we're starting to see a decrease in collaboration. And if that's the case, then we really can't ignite the impact we get from those diverse perspectives. So I thought that was an interesting kind of juxtaposition there. Going back to the Mercer survey, two questions stand out. One is, as you consider implementing some form of flexible work, what are the reasons? And then on the next slide, it'll talk about the challenges or the concerns. And one thing I'd ask you to do in the chat is, if these answers resonate with you, or you have some others in terms of your own reasons for taking a look at this or your concerns, please add them to the chat and we'll try to work them into the conversation as we go along. But in terms of the reasons, it's really the employee perspective. So raising engagement and productivity, increasing the employee value proposition, which helps attract talent within the organization. And we still have a lot of uncertainty going on regarding the pandemic. And so that's a reason to have this flexibility within the workforce. On the flip side of that, when you start to think about obstacles or concerns, one is the leaders and the manager's attitude. And I think there's two things that may be playing into that response is, one, their willingness to make that change, and then their capability or aptitude to do that, because they may have been very familiar with one style of leadership or management, and obviously going remote or to flexible requires a different skill set. And the other is on culture. And in many ways, the companies that had the strongest cultures going into the pandemic were able to be the most resilient and adaptive as they dealt with that. So not wanting that to be disrupted as a part of this process were reasons or concerns that go along with that. So again, please add into the chat, but I want to pause here for a little bit and just kind of open up to the panel. Give us 30, 60 seconds from your standpoint and of either the reasons that you were taking a look at it or some of your concerns. Dina, why don't you start us off there, please?
So our immediate reason for allowing work from home, because being manufacturing, it's a challenge. One was safety. So our employees, probably like most companies, they sit in cubes and really close desks. So we wanted to space them out. So we allowed people to start working from home, just right off the cuff. It was more of a safety perspective. The challenge we see with that is now bringing them back. So we've put in a lot of protective measures now that we know how to deal, for the most part, with the pandemic, with the health screenings, temperature checks. We put up plexiglass, and just we invested in our HVAC unit by putting in this filter system. So now trying to get people to come back is a challenge because they do like working from home, but we do see we are losing that collaboration, that just-in-time response, getting people to come together. Zoom is not always effective when you're trying to share ideas. So, it's great. We're trying to be accommodating to our employees with child care issues or schooling issues, but on the same time, it's posing to be a challenge to get people to come back. And how do you continue to manage through the child care issues? Because as of yesterday, just about all the schools are now going back to virtual. So, yeah.
And we're definitely going to keep visiting some things you brought up. Brad, you want to kind of give us a quick summary from your side when you think about TST, or, whether it's reasons or concerns that may be impacting your organization?
Yeah, I think we just had to break it down and say what roles could possibly be done remotely, and encourage those to go. And then when it came back to bringing people back to the office, we were actually surprised that we were very careful with the wording, that we weren't saying come back now, but we were saying if you felt comfortable, if felt safe, if you had childcare covered and all that. And we had an overwhelming response for people that wanted to come back to the office. And I think that's something that helped. I think you can survive. I think one of the lessons learned is that we can survive for a while in the remote environment, but having people being able to talk to each other, it really helps kind of promote the culture. And it's hard to onboard virtually. If we look at any of the struggles that we had, it was really it was trying to bring on new people during, when we couldn't have people at the office.
Well, and we're definitely going to highlight that onboarding a little bit later. I mean, throughout our preparation for this session, that's definitely been a theme. So, we'll try to dig into that a little bit further as we get into the study. Nick or Jeff, anything else you want to add there? Whether it's results of this survey that reflected your own experience, or maybe some other concerns or challenges that have stood out.
And for my company, we have we do a lot of production. So the ability for people to work remotely was not easy, but we did have the ability to provide really flexible schedules. So we run I would call an expanded 2-shift operation. And so we basically allowed people to come in at different times that fit well for them. And it might've been a medical issue or wanted to be, further distanced. The other thing is what Dina said is dependent care has become probably the most difficult one to manage because it's completely out of people's control with what's going on with these schools. So our biggest thing has been flexibility, transparency, and just ask for good communication.
Yeah, the only other thing I'll add, all these points have been critical for us, but the only thing I'll mention is, remote work for ADS has not meant, not just coming back to the office, but also our sales reps can't get out there and travel, can't get out there and see customers. So there is been some balance between, wanting our reps to get out and see customers and them wanting to go travel versus, obviously health and safety and, what are our office protocols and, if someone's traveling, when can they return to the office if they want to? That's certainly been something we've been thinking about and continue to think about.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because in many cases, these discussions have been very employee-centric as they should be. But then there's also, well, what do you need to do to serve those different customers? And we're going to talk a little bit about productivity later because something like that, if you're not able to engage with customers directly, may have some impact on productivity. All right, well, thank you for sharing that. Let me just a second here. We got a freeze overnight, so PowerPoint is a little sluggish in this colder weather. All right, here we go. All right. So again, just some of the research that we looked at going into this. I will highlight towards the end more of those resources, and there'll be links. And again, you'll get this as part of the PowerPoint that will be sent following the webinar. So as we get into this actual case study, some of the things. Well, let me start with a disclaimer. Is when you read through it, you would have seen reference to positive tests as it relates to COVID-19. And where that obviously is serious and require any company to respond effectively, this particular webinar and case study isn't necessarily focused on that response. It's really the impact of the pandemic on the future of the workforce. If you are looking for additional information on how you help create or enhance your own protocols, how you remain compliant with any state or federal requirements, or looking for tips and tools and other resources, I would invite you to go to the HRIC website because there is a recording of the first webinar session that we did on that very topic. So just in case you're thinking, well, why didn't they address the positive test? It's certainly a dynamic that raises the questions that we're going to try to answer here in the case study itself.
Dan, this is Dan Bell. Housekeeping question. Do you want comments from chat along the way or at the end?
Feel free to put them in as you go, particularly if there's something that we reference during the course of the conversation, and we'll try to get them during the flow, but otherwise we'll revisit them during Q&A, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we have one question from Ellen Miller that's in the chat window now. So you want to look at that? Fine, otherwise I can read it.
Let's see. So he mentions that, Brad talked about onboarding remotely as a challenge, and that working remotely is significantly easier and more productive if you already have established working relationships. And I fully expect we're going to get into that a little bit later with some of the prompts I'm going to have of the panel, particularly with, when you think about onboarding, it is a challenge. We'll dig into what are some things we can do to address those challenges, particularly as it relates to those working relationships. All right. So, for really the balance of the remainder of the discussion, our panel is really representing the executive team of Apex Mechanicals, and we've got to wrestle with what changes, if any, to make to our workplace practices. And, obviously, as you can see here, some of the team is already working on site, particularly those within operations and shipping. And so I could start with, there's an assumption because of this that we would have some form of hybrid approach. But let's discuss the merits a little bit of bringing the remaining team back to the office. And Brad sort of hinted at this earlier. Dina, if you wouldn't mind expanding on some of the things that you said earlier, if we were going to bring the whole group back for Apex, thinking about how you led the response to the pandemic as it relates to our policies and protocols, what do we need to do, or how are we prepared to bring everybody back in an attempt to go back to the old normal?
So I think first it's making sure you have the right safety measures in place. So are you going to temperature check? Are you going to symptom check? And then third, can you social distance the desks? Can you social distance common areas? Can you implement portable hand washing stations, sanitizing stations? So you've got to first make sure you can, implement all of those measures before you start bringing people back. And then the second is, I think Brad said it about, deciding who can come back. There's groups of people that can do their job remote with no issues. There are groups of people that can't. And then how do you manage that? How do you manage that balance of explaining to why person A can come and why person B is not? And then third, there's just the nature of work. Can your business continue to operate remotely, or do you really need everybody back? So I think if you kind of go through those areas, then you can make the case as to whether or not you can safely open your business.
And that is, an ongoing effort, an ongoing battle as this obviously continues to evolve. Nick and Brad, let me pivot to you. You're really representing that 35% of the workforce in many ways. Sales, marketing, those in the G&A functions, and we've talked about concerns over turnover as it relates to returning people to the office. So if you think about sales or project managers or what have you, talk a little bit about, what concerns you would have for those groups by returning them all to the office. Nick, why don't you jump in there?
Sure, I was waiting for Brad, but that's yeah. I mean, certainly. So, I mean, first of all, would be safety, right? I mean, your concern is, if someone doesn't need to be there and they get sick, it's obviously a concern. But I think also, if you're going to force somebody back who doesn't really want to be, your concern is also about unhappiness. And now that, a lot of the world is remote, it's very easy to lose somebody to a new job where, they could work for a job in Seattle, Washington, for example, and never have to move there, stay here in Virginia Beach and, quickly find an opening like that. And then we've also mentioned, just the fact that onboarding and hiring and recruiting is more of a challenge now remote. That's always in the back of your mind as well.
Brad, speak a little bit about, you raised, turnover in a prior discussion, particularly for some pivotal roles like project managers, in staying, or requiring them to come back. I mean, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we have kind of two, if you have different roles, that you have people that absolutely have to be there versus people that, can be, but it's helpful, that can work remotely, but it's probably more helpful to have it. I think that the way to truly address it is, a lot of it is from the management side. You need to address the longstanding, elephant in the room that is remote working. It means a reduction in overall productivity. And I think there's a longstanding belief in that you have to address. And the way to do that is that maybe the person's not at the desk, but if you focus on what the results are, then do you really care whether they're getting it done at 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon?
So I think that you said belief earlier, maybe it's even a myth. If I can't see them in the workplace, then they're not being productive. And by going remotely, this has forced us to observe and measure in maybe more objective ways about the contribution that people are making.
Well, and I think I've talked to a lot of people, a lot of coworkers, I've talked to a lot of peers and other companies and things. And I'm like, hey, we haven't had anybody in the office for 3 months, but things are still getting done. We're not really dropping the ball. This isn't, you're really afraid of a lot. So I think it's really forcing us to address, what's the most important part of the job.
Nick, I want to revisit something that you said, it's talking about how do you best explain to someone why they need to come back. So, obviously with some of the sales roles, maybe we have more flexibility. But in the event that, I even use your term, you said if we have to force them to come back, how might we explain that in a way that might reduce some of that disgruntlement, if that's a word, that comes along with it?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a tough one to answer. I mean, I think it does boil a lot down to productivity. Like I think Brad kind of hit on, we are more productive in the office when we're all there together, in some sense at least. But yeah, to be honest, I don't have a good answer for that.
Well, I think it's really hard, and I think the hardest part is just how bad text messages and emails are in trying to resolve conflict. And you see things just kind of spiral out of control just because either jokes are taken the wrong way or just inferred tone, or somebody just types in all caps. And it's just things you don't have to deal with, you take for granted when they're next door.
Yeah, I had a coworker at one point that everything was capitalized, and in the beginning was, "Hey, why are you shouting at us?" But it was
Right.
like, what? It's just too tiring to come up with the right punctuation and capitalization and everything else. So they just remained capitalized the entire time. Dina, I saw you come off mute. So did you have a comment there as well?
Well, I was just going to add, about bringing people back. One, it's understanding their reasons for not wanting to come back. We've had to have those conversations, as well as understanding, is there an underlying health condition? Normally you can't ask about health unless it's related to, directly to FMLA or one of those situations. But now kind of health is, you can talk about it. It's kind of off the table. You can just ask what you need to ask because of the nature of COVID. So, it's finding out, if someone's really adamant, it's finding out what's going on. This causes a lot of stress and anxiety. So is it health related? Is it mental? They're just fearful. I had that happen. Someone was just genuinely panicked about contracting COVID. And then lastly, can you do the role remotely? Like, we actually had to sit down and go through job by job and be like, no, this role needs to be here. So being manufacturing and I'm HR, it's like, no, we need to be here, and we take the necessary safety measures. So it's definitely a balancing act, and it's tricky because every case is different. You can't put a blanket statement and say, oh yes, all these people are coming back, or these people are just resentful because they like working from home. Sometimes there's underlying conditions.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. And there was actually a presentation earlier this week from HR leaders, and David Ulrich had mentioned that is, in the past, we may have had global policies and procedures, whether they were HR or others. And what this has forced us to do is really have personalized approaches as well. So, Jeff, you mentioned this earlier, we've got to be transparent. We've got to communicate frequently because things are moving. And with that, I'm going to pivot to you. We saw in some of the external surveys that employees seem to want to work remotely, at least those that are already doing that. And I know that you've got some thoughts as it relates to some of those survey results. But also, we think about your team, they're primarily on site. And you've expressed some concerns about a remote workforce as well. Can you share a little bit of your thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit earlier. A lot of the data that you're getting in the general public is looking back. But our goal, we have a lot of people here, and certainly we were open to make changes. And like Dina said, there were unique discussions with individuals, which we worked with, understanding, help make accommodations. And what was great is their coworkers were usually aware and very open to allow people to do special things if they needed to. So that's great. But one of the important things for us is looking forward. So our big item that concerns us is with anything remote is employee training and development. That teamwork aspect, working as a group. Brad kind of made a comment about, does it matter if I do it at 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning? In a lot of instances in our business, it does, because we have synchronized work. So if we break that, it's adding on to our lead time. It's actually adding cost, and then it is creating potential quality gaps as well. So there's some synchronization on work that has to take place for different reasons. The other thing we see is, developing people, leadership qualities, some of the soft skills. The technical, a lot of these surveys and comments are based on, are you doing the technical or the skilled type work? But it's really difficult to replace like leadership training in a remote setting. I mean, that's, interaction. Brad or someone mentioned conflict resolution. There's a lot of soft skills that are learned in the workplace. It could be part of the company culture. It could be part of a formal training program. But those are the things looking forward. How is the workforce going to continue to develop? If you just took your workforce and you had a static level of skill and you could be successful doing that, then it's probably not much of a concern. But there's very few businesses that do that. I'm familiar with all the panelists and the companies that they work with, and they each have a unique culture. That my company has a unique culture. So those are the things that, as people look forward to into the future, how are you going to continue to develop as a company in whatever ways are important to your company?
So let's dig into that a little bit more. Onboarding has now come up several times, in the conversation. It's also been on the chat. What are some things that we can do as it relates to onboarding, noting that a lot of that is going to be virtual? What can we do to be more effective in the area, or what have you seen that has been effective so far? Jeff, I'll let you continue, and then we'll bounce around the panel.
I mean, I have a few examples that, and everyone, you'd have to validate they'd work for your company. The most extreme one I saw is a company dispatched basically second laptops to everyone and has them actively participating in an online chat all day long. So if you need to deal with your team's actually online on a different piece of equipment. Obviously, you're only interacting when you need to, but they're there and they're on camera. Potentially, people thought it was a little intrusive, but in the end, it was really very effective because you could see everyone participating, and you could do one-on-one chats or you could do group chats like within seconds. There was a way to instant message, everyone get on, take care of the topic, and then you can get off, but the visual is there. So that was a pretty good idea. It's a lot of technology, got to the bandwidth. That was a good idea that I thought was really effective for people in a fairly large organization. So that's one to consider. Other ones I've seen, I work with an organization that they schedule weekly one-on-ones with like a supervisor and individuals in the team to, make sure there's an open forum, that they're, constantly able to work on things that are more employee-based individually. So that's an easy thing to do, but there's a set schedule so the people can prepare and make effective use of the time.
Others, feel free to jump in if you've got some other thoughts on what could or what has strengthened your onboarding.
I'd say the best examples that I've seen at ADS are when folks kind of just go above and beyond. I mean, it takes effort, I would say, in this remote environment. I've had a couple good examples where people I don't work with that closely, but I'll hear from once or twice a month have scheduled Zoom calls with me just to meet with their new hires and just to introduce everybody within the company, and they're kind of bouncing around. So it takes time, in place of just walking around the office and introducing them to everybody. It's getting time on their calendar and telling them what different functions of the company do and who they might be interacting with. I've definitely appreciated when people have done that. So I just don't get a random email one day from somebody I didn't even know worked for our company.
I think we're all used to when you're in the office, there generally would be then the tour around the floor or even around the building, and you get a chance to meet people in person and make that connection. And with when we're virtual, that may not be top of mind. So I've seen some, nope, we're going to make a plan that you're going to get that virtual, office tour, and much to what, Jeff said, where there may have been scheduled one-to-one, that is part of the onboarding. Certainly, if there's other thoughts, please chime in. Brad, this might be getting into the weeds of on the expense side a little bit more, but when we think about, if it was issuing laptops or some of the other technology, I think you also face some things from a tax implications, things to think about as people might be going more remote or trying to make that permanent. Is there something from, that expense side that we should be considering?
I think that's a good question. I think that we are seeing lower expenses just because of lack of travel. And, right now, but, as far as for revenue, I think it really is, it really is affecting business development. So companies that have big backlogs are kind of, chugging along, but it is hard to, continue to grow and to prospect. And so, from our standpoint, TST has three companies: the construction, the manufacturing, and a construction services company. And two of them have big backlogs, and one of them doesn't. And the one that didn't, it hurt for a little bit. So I think that we've seen a reduction in overall expenses, but the revenue long term, I think, is something that brings up concerns.
What I think is unique, here, particularly if you juxtapose it against some of the surveys that we've seen where there was higher interest in remote work. I think each of your companies have shared, people were eager to come back. They understood, why they needed to come back. But, as I mentioned in the beginning, there likely is going to be some form of hybrid, whether it's a portion of the workforce is 100% remote where the others are not. And so, I'll start with you here, but, as you think about any potential conflict between those that are on property and those that, have perceived more flexibility because of their function, how do we address that? And just to give you an even longer question to think about, is, how do we drive productivity, well-being, and collaboration all at the same time when you've got, this potential for conflict because some get to work remotely and some don't?
And another comment from Alan Miller waiting for you.
Okay, I'll get there after Dean has a chance to respond.
Wow. So, wow, that is a lot to consider. I think, so let's start. Go ahead. The first point you asked, you wanted to know about was resolving the conflict.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing I think our new reality is I may be in a role that requires, I'm in the 65% in this case study, right? Let's say I'm in that 65%, got to come in. And I've got a good friend in the company and they're in that 35%. So they either can stay remote or they've got perceived a lot more flexibility.
Right.
And so all of a sudden there's this tension because my perception of somebody that quote unquote has to be, in the warehouse, on the shop floor, in the office, and this other person doesn't. Now you're getting into the issue of equity, fairness. And, how can we address that potential conflict? Because it's another spoiler of productivity potential.
Right. So going back to what Jeff said, first, we're manufacturing. So you're right. We have these processes that are all timed and they are synchronous, to use his words. So I think the first thing is helping them understand their role in the company and revisiting that, hey, you're part of a team that does XYZ, and unfortunately you can't do XYZ from home, whereas person A can do their job from home. So some of the admin work, some of the customer calling and the purchasing and the planning, they're not physically touching the product. So unfortunately you in this role, while yes, we'd all love to be home, work from home, we can't. So I think just demonstrating empathy and compassion, letting them understand, I hear you, I know, but unfortunately, your role requires you to be here. So we did face that. Three of our buildings had to be here. The admin building didn't have to be here. So that definitely created some tension. Oh, the admin building, once again, benefits to them. But I think it was just really explaining, hey, this is, we want to keep our doors open. We want to keep producing products so all of us can get paid. So when you help them understand the pros and cons and the costs and benefits, again, in a humanistic approach, it wasn't all just about the business. It was about, hey, you matter, and we're trying to keep the doors open, and this is why. So now, we're trying to be fair and flexible to everybody, but in some cases, we just can't. So, one-on-one approaches.
I think in our case, we had a few individuals that had excruciating circumstances, and we tried to provide offered other positions that would kind of take them out of a certain area, just to say, hey, we can't satisfy exactly, we need a body or bodies to do a certain operation. And if you can't do that, here are some other options, but those come with trade-offs as well. So making the attempt buys a tremendous amount of great, goodwill between the employee and the company. However, in the end, it has to be equitable for both parties. So sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. But there are people in our organization that had requirements that we could not meet, and they had to depart over time for different reasons. And the nice thing was when they left, they knew, hey, if this situation reverts back to a condition where you can come back under these certain conditions, you're always welcome back. And the federal law has allowed people to do that, which we follow the federal law. We were very clear when the FFCRA came out and other things. And so there were mechanisms for people to do that, and FMLA. So we certainly, as companies, try and accommodate folks, but there are circumstances that are really extreme for some people.
And Jeff, my assumption there is if somebody's saying, hey, I'm looking for a change, if you were going to change their role, that likely was going from something that allowed for more remote
Yes,
work.
if it was possible. In our case, it was very limited, but it was discussed. Our bigger opportunity was changing their hours. So they, if you needed to come in at 10:30 in the morning and leave at 4:15, we were wide open on that for a very long period of time. That's decreased a little bit, but we still can accommodate, especially for these dependent care issues.
Nick, you mentioned something earlier, with the sales group within ADS. I mean, typically they're on the road anyways, whether it was pandemic or not, they may have always been out of the office. And now that they're finding, they can't do that, even though they're quote unquote remote, what impact is that having on, kind of their well-being in terms of, man, I'm used to being that road warrior, and now I'm stuck in my home office. Are you having to deal with that in terms of impact on well-being and productivity?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, a lot of them want to be on the road. We hear that constantly. I mean, thankfully, we've been able to return to that a little bit, because obviously that's how they earn their money, off of commission, off of making sales. I also have, early on, not as much before, but I had heard, some grumblings that they were more busy, whereas a week would be dedicated to one or two customers going to visit them. Now they're talking to 20 different customers a day, just bouncing from call to call to call, whereas they were able to dedicate, 2 to 3 days for that customer in the past. It's kind of shortened their interactions and made them more frequent.
And is it more or less productive that way? So, going from maybe fewer customers in a week that I'm seeing personally versus now I can hit multiple in a week. What's been
In the short term, I would say productivity has been similar to the way things were before. But I have heard, a lot of people express concerns about the long term. I think we've hit on this earlier, but just in terms of relationship building, like you've got a relationship with this customer now, but when that person, a lot of our customers are military, so whenever that person leaves their position in the military, you've got a new person coming in that we don't know, that we've never met in person. So what will that relationship look like, 2 years from now when we've never met that person face to face?
Gotcha. Brad, I want to go back to something that you said, early on, that there was this overwhelming response of people eager to get back into the office. And I'm going to keep visiting kind of that is a little bit different than what we see in some of the survey research, which is fine. What were the reasons to get back?
I think that it's hard to work from home for a lot of people, especially with their kids are still at home, or maybe their significant other is working from home as well, just physically having the space. I think that they, if you think about it, hopefully we're in situations that we like the people that we work with as well too, right? A lot of your coworkers are kind of your best friends as well. And you spend more time with some of your coworkers than you do with your significant other. So I think that it can be some of it depends on, I guess, the culture, but you have friends and you miss those interactions. And I think that we certainly saw that. I think some of the data beforehand, I think some of the wording was, 98% of people that have been working remotely, maybe they've been working remotely for a year, so they have their setup done, and they were working remotely pandemic, and they would never go back. Once you've done it, you wouldn't go back and go do it. And I can understand that. But for me personally, I had trouble working from the house.
Well, I want to make sure that we've got time to cover the resources and some Q&A at the end. But again, onboarding has been somewhat of a topic here. So we had a comment from Alan Miller in the chat, like how can we improve on that? Now, if the company has an intranet, then for new hires, it can have welcome videos from the CEO, documentation on the acronyms or other jargon that's used within the company, things they're going to hear in the meetings, and then obviously relevant training videos, whether they're acclimating them to the culture or their technical or functional training in nature. So if you have an intranet but haven't used that for onboarding, that's an option to the audience or something you may want to pursue.
I just wrote that down. Thanks, Alan. Yeah.
So, we spent a lot of time kind of talking about the challenges of this, but Nick, I'll start with you. There are, people are attracted to remote. What are we seeing as, the gains from it, for those that have the capability of doing it, or, what are some reasons where we might want to expand that, post-pandemic? Talk a little bit about what can be a benefit.
Sure. I think the biggest issue trying to transition away from the sales to the finance, and not to steal Brad's thunder, but we've obviously mentioned the cost savings. That's been huge. Whether it be from the travel for the sales reps I mentioned, or trade shows we typically have, cost savings have been massive. Another thing that comes to mind is, you mentioned kind of the diverse perspectives earlier. That kind of reminds me that, remote work kind of allows for a greater access to a talent pool here, whereas kind of in the past, you might have been somewhat isolated to Virginia Beach or Hampton Roads. Specifically for IT, this has kind of been big for us. That's an area where a lot of people do want to work remote. So we've been able to expand out and hire from outside the area and have them plan to work remote permanently if they want to. And then the other thing that kind of comes to mind is just kind of preparedness. Like when this all hit, it was a big transition and a lot of people were shocked. What do I do? I just feel like now, if anything, God forbid, obviously it came up, our team would be better prepared to kind of transition back to a remote work once we're obviously back to back.
Thank you. Jeff, while yours was more of different schedules versus remote, can you share a little bit more about the lessons learned or, what worked well in going to, kind of those, the different schedules that you mentioned earlier? Since I've certainly continued to come back to remote work or flexible work, but that is another opportunity that the audience consider. Can you share a little bit more there?
Yeah. So, for organizations, there's kind of a core group of hours that people may need to overlap. And it could be limited to a couple hours a day, but kind of expanding the hours that your facility operates doesn't really drive a lot of cost up, as long as you have adequate number of people and the safety and security is there for people. That's what a big thing for us was. It was like, hey, what can you work? Even if you go down to what we would consider a part-time status, that was fine too. So, people generally, our folks at least, they want to go to work, and they want the socialization. And there was a comment I think Dina may have made early on about the mental health aspect of it, but that's another thing that we're seeing. You're seeing more data coming out of school age children right now, but you're going to see it out of the workplace as well, is people want the socialization. I work with other folks outside of here in organizations that's actually been a complaint, that they want to be social. They want to work around other folks because they don't have a great spot to work at home. I don't know about folks on the panel, but there are a lot of places in the country and in Virginia, they don't have adequate internet connection or internet service to work remotely. It's definitely in the Hampton Roads area, but all throughout Virginia. You don't have to creep very far out of some of the populated areas to get into some very weak service. So that's another thing, is it's just not available to some of our folks that live out in some of the more rural areas. So again, looking at your population, figuring out what works for them, that's what I'd recommend.
Well, and then just reflecting on that in the comment that Dina made earlier, and maybe it's counterintuitive, but if you've got folks that you're requiring to come in again to the workplace, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, I've got my peers that don't have to in other departments. Sometimes pointing out that there are challenges. I think sometimes we just think, oh, remote means nothing but blue skies and sunshine. And there are challenges in well-being, socialization, productivity, connectivity, and why it may be, sharing some of that reality too, that there are some advantages in coming in may help if employees in the audience are experiencing some of that tension within the workplace. I know we're getting up to the 3 o'clock hour here, so let me pivot real quick. We have mentioned a number of different resources. So again, this PowerPoint will go out afterwards, but the link to Mercer and some of the other surveys that we used are on here, as well as other resources that if you are remote, if not working effectively you like, or you are considering going, then there are some different tips, tools, and resources that will be a part of it. One thing I did want to bring up and invite Dina back in here too is another thing we've got to think about in terms of remote is you've heard the news on Pfizer and Moderna that we're starting to see progress as it relates to a vaccine, and that's going to have some impact as well. And so, Dina, if you wouldn't mind sharing some thoughts, what should the audience think about as we start to hear more and more about the vaccines and vaccinations for employees?
Yeah, thank you. So I think one of the things we're looking at is, one, are you going to make it required? Are you going to make it, people have to get the vaccine when it becomes available. So first and foremost, there's a lot of press coming out, yes, about the vaccine is, it's almost available. And now I got an email, Centara is going to be able to, offer it first responders, healthcare, at risk and whatnot. And then CVS has been indicated. So I think as a company, you need to decide, pay attention to the laws. We as employers have not been given approval to require the vaccine. So, originally when this all started, you couldn't even temperature check. Then they released the law saying, yes, you can temperature check and symptom check. So I think you want to be really mindful, pay attention to what the law says you can do. The ADA, the EEOC, VOSH, all of those agencies, make sure you're following them for when they tell you what you can and cannot do. A nonprofit or a hospital is different. They can require their employees to get vaccinated, but the private employers, you're gonna have to decide, what do you want to do? If it's allowed, can you make that requirement? So I think that's kind of what I know as a company we're waiting for. We've actually asked a couple of different partners, when the vaccine becomes available, will we be able to get it on site like we do the flu shots? If we offer a flu shot clinic, can we offer a COVID-19 clinic for people that want to get it? So, we're just waiting and seeing, but as a company, not at this moment, we're not going to make it required unless, we get the green light that you can. And then you really got to make sure people's health history, because we're on this fine line. You got personal health and now vaccines, and where you cross. Is that something that employees are going to be comfortable with? Because you can't force them to get a flu shot, but can you force them to get a COVID-19?
Well, and there I'll plug the last bullet on screen, whether it's with the progress on the vaccines or some of these other topics. Feel free to reach out to HR SHRM, Hampton Roads SHRM, and the larger nationwide SHRM. There's a lot of resources out there. If you're finding something that's on the member only side, certainly reach out to HR SHRM, and there's probably some ways we can share that information with you. Looks like we've addressed some of the questions or comments previously. We got about 2 minutes left. I thought it'd open up, Brad, Jeff, or Nick, parting shots on, what you would share with the audience to, help continue to be effective as you deal with this current and post-pandemic workforce. Brad, I'll start with you just because you're on the top of my screen.
All right, that sounds good. I just have the recommendation. I try to ban IMs, and I know it's a cool tool and you can do things quickly, but pick up the phone and make the call right now. If you can't see the person, pick up the phone, call them, or even better, do a video chat so you can read their face when you get to make sure they're receiving it the right way, the way that you're intending it.
Thank you.
Because it's a whole, the little bit of extra work there on the front end really helps.
Great, thanks. Jeff, how about 30 seconds from you?
I think the thing that we are really focusing on is good communication, positive communication, and trying to support that mental health aspect of it. A lot of folks, the most positive place they go right now for lots of different reasons is their work. The people, they have a lot of stress outside of work. A lot of it has to do with this dependent care. So anything that we can do to help people feel good. We've been doing all kinds of things for people, lunches and different things, just to make sure that it's a positive experience under the very difficult circumstances people are all living under.
All right, Nick, parting shots, got to be quick here, but.
I'll keep it short. I would just say encourage people to take their time off, their vacation. It's difficult when you're sitting around, but tell them to get off the computer, enjoy their time, go do something outside.
One of the things that just to hopefully put an exclamation point on that we heard throughout this is the emphasis on the employee experience and their well-being, and that may sound pretty straightforward. But prior to the pandemic, that wasn't necessarily always the case. And I think what we're hearing from the panel is we've got to be thinking about that, onboarding, leadership training, well-being and the like. And so certainly a key takeaway from that. So I want to thank the panel again for sharing their experiences, kind of the practical realities they're dealing with as it relates to the workplace. And thanks again to the Hampton Roads Innovation Collaborative and HR SHRM and Concursive for hosting the session number 2 in this HR Huddle series. And thanks everybody that participated, and you'll receive an email afterwards with a link to the recording and the PowerPoint. Thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, you too.